They say every great American dynasty left behind a scandal, a missing line in the ledger, a rumor that never made it to print. But what if one of the most powerful families of the Gilded Age went further? What if they erased a life before it even had a name? Tonight, we open a file that was never meant to survive, and once you hear what's inside, you'll never look at the Vanderbilt legacy the same way again. It begins in a shuttered room on the east wing of an old Vanderbilt-affiliated mansion. The kind built, not for comfort, but for spectacle. High ceilings, steel-framed windows, and silence heavy enough to feel intentional. Restoration crews had been working through boxes of private archives, sorting decades of correspondence and receipts, when a thin, unmarked dossier slipped from between two leather-bound ledgers. No crest, no date, no curator's tag. Just brittle paper, hospital invoices, hurried notes from household employees, and a single reference to an arrival that appears nowhere in the Vanderbilt genealogical charts. A birth that happened, but was never supposed to be written down. The Gilded Age was an era obsessed with records, with the precision of names and inheritances. Nothing was filed without purpose, which is why this stray collection of documents feels less like an accident and more like an act of defiance. Someone kept these pages, someone hid them, and someone else made sure the story attached to them vanished from every official archive. Before these, papers disappeared. There were whispers, servants dismissed without explanation, a doctor transferred to another state within days, journalists warned off a potential domestic indiscretion inside a Fifth Avenue residence. Society pages from the late 1880s hint at unusual activity in one branch of the family, but every follow-up inquiry was quietly redirected, articles pulled, notes burned. Surviving ledgers show gaps the size of entire seasons, as if whole months were wiped clean. Even internal family letters include abrupt shifts in tone, references blackened with ink so dense it bleeds through the page. In the middle of New York's most ostentatious age, when mansions rose like monuments and reputations were built on marble and money, something happened that the Vanderbilt machine moved quickly to bury. But hidden stories strain against their silence, and this file, fragile as it is, opens a door that was meant to stay sealed, a birth without a record in a family obsessed with legacy. A child who appears once, in a note, in a receipt, in a margin, and then disappears completely. These are the stories this channel exists to uncover. What the elite tried to erase, the shadows behind the gold. If you've ever heard of a sealed room, a missing heir, or a name struck from history, tell me in the comments. And if stories like this matter to you, stories pried loose from the grip of America's most powerful dynasties, leave a like and subscribe before this one slips through your fingers. Because sometimes the truth isn't lost, it's hidden. And tonight, we are about to disturb something the Gilded Age tried to forget. By the time you step back from that unmarked dossier and look up at the walls of the mansion, it's hard not to remember what the Vanderbilt name once meant in this country. In the closing decades of the 19th century, the Gilded Age wasn't just an era, it was a stage, and the Vanderbilts controlled the rail lines that delivered the audience. Steel, steam, and schedules stitched the nation together, and their fortune flowed along those tracks straight into New York, into facades of limestone and marble that rose along Fifth Avenue like private monuments. Their mansions weren't homes in the ordinary sense. They were arguments carved in stone, each ballroom, each staircase, each chandelier announcing that this family had arrived and that they intended to stay written into the American story. Inside those halls, everything was curated. Guest lists, seating charts, even the order in which carriages were permitted to approach the front steps were calculated to reinforce hierarchy. Marriages were not merely unions, but mergers, alliances between railroad money and old-world titles, between new American wealth and European legitimacy. A daughter's wedding could realign social maps, draw a line through one name and circle another. In that world, genealogy was not a sentimental family tree. It was infrastructure, as important as any rail line crossing a continent. When you understand that, the idea of a birth that doesn't fit, of a life that appears nowhere in the official books, stops sounding like a romantic rumor and starts feeling like a breach in the system itself. The image of the Vanderbilts in the public eye was no accident. It was guarded by secretaries, lawyers, and editors as carefully as any vault. Society pages wrote what they were allowed to see: glittering balls in the Marble Twins, winter seasons in Newport, portraits unveiled in gilded frames. But the same newspapers that praised their philanthropy knew when to look away. A whisper about a scandal could be softened into a line about indisposition. A question about a child's absence could vanish between editions. Letters that asked too much might never be answered. Letters that admitted too much might never reach the archive. Some were simply burned, their ash mixing with coal soot on the wind above the city. Others were edited with a patient hand, sentences rephrased until a raw admission became a vague illusion, the rough edges of truth smoothed down in the name of decorum. This is where the guilt and the silence of the elite begin to blur. How many reputations were protected not by innocence, but by the efficiency of encobramento, by a decision in a paneled office that something was better left unrecorded. In an age when fortunes could rise or fall with a headline, the fear was not just of what had happened, but of who might read about it. One stray paragraph, one careless mention of a child born in the wrong place to the wrong woman, could ripple through inheritance law, through wills and trusts carefully drafted to keep capital and power on a narrow path. So the machinery engaged, private detectives paid to clarify facts, doctors reminded of their duty to discretion, household staff relocated with generous references and one final warning never to repeat what they had seen. Silent witnesses, everywhere, trained by the weight of the name above the door to keep their stories to themselves. From the outside, this looked like stability. To the families inside, it was something closer to constant tension, a dark legacy managed rather than confronted. The Gilded Age glittered on the surface, but behind those shutters, there were forbidden rooms no guest ever entered. Conversations that stopped when footsteps approached. Erased records that left just enough of a gap for those who knew where to look. This is the kind of pattern we see again and again in Golden Age secrets. A controlled image, a carefully polished narrative, and then, just at the edge of the frame, something that refuses to fit. A ledger line with no explanation. A nurse's name that appears only once. A payment to a doctor outside the usual circle. You can almost feel the anxiety in the way the ink is pressed into the paper, the way a date is overwritten, the way a margin note trails off mid-sentence. Looking back now, with these scattered documents in your hands, you have to ask yourself a question that the people who created them never expected anyone to face. Would you have had the courage in that world to open a file that hints at a hidden heir, a life deliberately removed from a tree where every branch was numbered and displayed? Or would you have shut the drawer, turned the key, and pretended you never saw it? Because this is not just about one child, one rumor. It's about how power decides which lives matter, enough to be remembered and which are safer as shadows. As you return your eyes to the dossier on the table, the contrast between the official story and what lies in front of you becomes almost physical. The grand Vanderbilt houses still appear in guidebooks, their ballrooms restored, their portraits cleaned and lit. But here, in this quiet room, there is a page with a name that should not exist, or rather, a name that once existed and now has been methodically crossed out, the ink so dark and deliberate that the letters beneath it seem to struggle for air beneath the black. For a moment, the entire mansion feels like it's holding its breath. When you look again at that blacked-out name, you start to notice something else. The page around it is not alone. The dossier, once just a thin stack of brittle paper, begins to behave like a map. On top is the obvious scar, ink dragged over letters that refuse to fully disappear. But underneath, layered in different hands and different kinds of paper, there are quieter traces. A folded receipt, a crease worn by fingers that opened and closed it more times than anyone wanted to admit, and a number in the corner that doesn't belong to any standard Vanderbilt filing system. It's the kind of small inconsistency that means nothing by itself, and everything when you place it in the right decade. The receipt is dated from a year when the Vanderbilt houses were at their brightest, when Fifth Avenue facades gleamed and the newspapers called it progress instead of excess. The payee is not a well-known physician or one of the elite hospitals the family usually favored. It's a midwife. Not from Manhattan, but from a quieter address on the outskirts of the city, one of those boarding houses that specialized in discretion, where curtains were always drawn a little too tightly, and neighbors were accustomed to pretending they didn't see who stepped out of the carriage at odd hours. The language on the receipt is modest. Services rendered, attendance, supplies, no diagnosis, no name attached to the patient. Just the signature of a woman whose profession was necessary, but never listed in the society pages. If you've studied enough Gilded Age families, you recognize the pattern. When pregnancies were celebrated, there were announcements, florists, calls to the best physicians, letters of congratulations preserved in family scrapbooks. When pregnancies were inconvenient, there were addresses like this: quiet streets, intermediate houses, payments that originated from one account and were routed through another. In the world of Golden Age secrets, nothing screams louder than a piece of paper that is designed not to say too much. Pressed next to the midwife's receipt is a different kind of document, a property record typed in the careful language of lawyers. It notes a short-term lease on a modest residence, an annex identified as suitable for temporary accommodations, with a clause that allows termination on unusually flexible terms. What stands out is not what's written, but what stops short. An amendment is started and then abandoned, the last line trailing off mid-sentence, as if whoever drafted it either changed their mind or was told to. The ink of the unfinished clause is slightly darker, slightly fresher than the main body, suggesting hesitation or a late decision made under pressure. Someone began to formalize something here, and then decided that the best way to protect a legacy was to leave the rest unwritten. You can almost hear the quiet negotiations in a paneled office somewhere uptown. The creak of leather chairs, the clink of a pen set down on a blotter, the pause before a lawyer says that certain matters are better handled informally. The weight of secrets is rarely dramatic in the moment. It's measured in those pauses, in the way someone's hand tightens around a fountain pen before deciding not to sign. In another margin, on a completely separate sheet, there's a small handwritten note that at first glance seems harmless. Make sure accommodations remain away from main house staff. No name, no context, no explicit explanation. But placed alongside the midwife's payment and the half-finished lease, it starts to sound less like a logistical instruction and more like a quiet acknowledgement that something or someone would need to be hidden from the usual circle of servants and visitors. Hidden heirs don't usually announce themselves with a birth certificate. They appear in footnotes, in delivery charges, in strange patterns of absence and presence. These fragments are not proof. A historian, a lawyer, a descendant defending the official story could argue that each piece has an innocent explanation: philanthropy, medical charity, a temporary refuge for someone with a delicate condition unrelated to the family. And yet, in the context of a dynasty that tracked every engagement and every renovation down to the last imported marble tile, the gaps and overlaps begin to feel intentional. Erased records don't leave nothing behind. They leave edges, shadows, inconsistencies that only look harmless if you view them one at a time. Look closer and you notice the timeline shifting around these papers. In the household staff ledger for that same year, one nurse disappears from the record with no reason given, while a new maid is added at the annex address instead of the main residence. A coachman's route is altered for a few months, his hours stretching late into the night and early morning, then returning to normal as if nothing had happened. A laundress listed for off-site linens appears briefly and then vanishes, her pay discontinued without any note of dismissal or retirement. Silent witnesses, all of them, recorded only in the language of wages and schedules. In public, the Vanderbilt calendar for that season is luminous. Charity balls, opera boxes, visiting dignitaries. Behind the scenes, money moves in small, careful amounts to people and places that no official family historian ever bothers to mention. This is how a dark legacy sustains itself, not with one dramatic cover-up, but with dozens of small adjustments, each one justified at the time as discretion or protection of the family name. It's how hidden heirs remain hidden, and how forbidden rooms stay sealed even when the rest of the house is on display. By the time you stack the documents in order, the midwife's receipt, the incomplete lease, the marginal note about temporary accommodations, the staff changes, the crossed-out name, you're no longer asking whether something happened. You're asking how many people had to agree not to see it. The midwife who signed without a patient name, the lawyer who stopped mid-sentence, the servants who followed new instructions without questions, the archivist who filed this thin, dangerous bundle in a place where it might never be opened. And yet, here it is, decades later, in your hands, in a mansion that now hosts tours and lectures about art and architecture while this small pocket of truth sits in the dark. These papers were never meant to be part of the official Vanderbilt story. They belong to another narrative entirely, one that threads through back corridors, carriage houses, and rented rooms on unfashionable streets. A narrative of someone who may have been born into the orbit of immense wealth and yet denied even the simplest acknowledgement. A line in a family Bible, a place. On a chart, a name allowed to remain in ink. As you turn the last page in the dossier, a folded sheet slips free. Thicker stock, the kind used for internal plans rather than correspondence. It's a simple floor outline, an early sketch of one of the lesser-known Vanderbilt properties. Faint pencil marks marking rooms and corridors. At first, it looks unremarkable. A service wing, a main hall, a carriage entrance. Then your eye catches a faint erasure and a lightly redrawn line along one side wall. There, in smudged graphite, barely visible unless you tilt the paper toward the light, is a narrow doorway leading to a small, unlabeled space. In the final, inked version of the blueprint, that door no longer exists. But on this draft, it's still there. An opening that wasn't supposed to be remembered, lingering like a question that has waited more than a century for someone to notice. Once you've seen the erased doorway on that faded floor plan, it becomes almost impossible not to wonder who once moved through it. And in the Gilded Age, doors were not the only things that could disappear without explanation. People could too, especially the ones who carried trays, polished banisters, and knew the shape of a family's life better than any guest. So the next place you turn in this quiet archive isn't another blueprint or lease, but something far more mundane. Payroll lists. Neat columns of names, positions, wages, and dates, written in the careful, repetitive hand of a household clerk, who never imagined anyone would read them for meaning, only for math. At first glance, everything looks ordinary. There is the familiar hierarchy of a great house. Butler at the top, footmen beneath him, housemaids and kitchen staff, nurses, governesses, coachmen, laundresses, all arranged like invisible scaffolding behind the Vanderbilt facade. The dates march on steadily until they don't. In the very months that match the midwife's receipt and the temporary accommodations outside the main residence, the smooth pattern fractures. A nurse listed for years disappears between one line and the next, with no notation of marriage, retirement, or transfer. A lady's maid who had served the same branch of the family for nearly a decade is suddenly replaced by a new hire with no prior connection. A junior footman appears for 3 pay periods, then vanishes as if the ink itself refused to hold him. It's subtle, but when you trace the names with your finger, the gaps feel less like chance, and more like someone quietly lifting pieces from a board. In Gilded Age households, servants were supposed to be steady fixtures of the background, a promise of continuity. Rapid turnover in key positions, nursery staff, chambermaids assigned to private suites, trusted valets, was unusual enough that it often had a story attached, if only in whispers below stairs. The documents don't record those whispers, of course. They record only the outcome. position vacant, replaced, dismissed, or sometimes nothing at all. And yet, a different bundle of papers, tied with a thinning ribbon, adds flesh to those bare bones. These are letters of recommendation, the passports of the servant class. In a world where reputation was currency, a good word from a Vanderbilt household could secure a position for life. Most of these letters are formulaic, praise for punctuality, sobriety, respectability. But a few, dated in suspicious proximity to the other traces you've been following, carry a different tone. One references a maid who is leaving for reasons not connected to her conduct. Another insists on the absolute discretion of a nurse whose departure is described as unfortunate but necessary in light of changes in the household. The words are polite, but the spaces between them hum with something unsaid. The most telling document isn't even addressed to an employer. It's a brittle, folded letter from an aging former butler, written decades after his service, never mailed, and found among his personal effects, then somehow copied into the family's own archive, as if someone, somewhere, understood its value or its danger. In calm, trained handwriting, he records a delicate situation that arose during my tenure, resolved with speed and discretion at the highest levels of the family's council. No names, no dates, only a brief, chilling line. Those of us who were asked to remain silent did so, not for lack of conscience, but because the weight of that house was heavier than any one man's truth. It's the closest thing to a confession you're likely to find in the paper trail of a dynasty that specialized in Golden Age secrets. Hidden heirs, in stories like these, don't hover like ghosts. They cast shadows in exactly this way. In the logic of inheritance and succession, every acknowledged child is a calculation. Titles, trusts, stock, property. An unrecognized birth threatens to rearrange the arithmetic, especially if it can be tied to the wrong mother, the wrong timing, the wrong set of witnesses. The price of protecting the official narrative is paid not only in suppressed documents and edited ledgers, but in the lives of silent witnesses dismissed with a month's wages and an urgent reference, sent away before they can forget, told in no uncertain terms, never to remember out loud. From the point of view of the public record, the house remains stable. The newspapers still describe glittering balls. The architect's drawings still show only the rooms meant to be admired. But behind the servant's entrance, the air changes. A hallway grows quieter. A familiar pair of footsteps no longer climbs the service stairs at dawn. Conversations halt more sharply when certain doors open. The dark legacy of a family like this doesn't just live in scandalous headlines. It lives in the way a kitchen falls silent when the butler enters after returning from an interview with the family lawyer, in the way eyes drop to the floor when a question isn't supposed to be asked. Imagine the house in those weeks. The rustle of skirts in the back corridors, the muted thud of trunks being carried out, a maid folding a uniform she will never wear again. No one says why she's leaving. The official reason might be ill health or family matters in the old country, phrases that cover everything and reveal nothing. But the timing lines up too neatly with the annex lease being quietly terminated, with the midwife's last recorded payment, with the sudden reappearance of normality in the household books. This is how erased records look when they're made of people. For the servants, the calculation was brutal and simple. To speak was to risk everything. Future employment, references, the ability to send money home. The fear of destroying reputations did not belong only to the Vanderbilts. It trickled down to those whose survival depended on proximity to that name. So they became, by necessity, part of the architecture, present, observant, and then, when required, carefully removed. Silent witnesses, trained by years of service to understand that some doors in these forbidden rooms stayed closed for a reason. When you lay the payroll lists, the recommendation letters, and that unsent confession side by side, the pattern no longer feels accidental. A cluster of departures around a single season. Staff whose roles placed them closest to bedrooms, private parlors, and back staircases. An old butler who, decades later, still couldn't bring himself to write what he had seen, only that it changed him. The official genealogies of the Vanderbilt line glide past those months as if nothing at all happened. No birth, no illness, no delicate situation. Yet the human record, in the ink of wages and references, tells another story. Something significant occurred, and everyone who might have spoken of it was relocated, replaced, or silenced. And then, as if the archive itself wants to remind you that no amount of control is perfect, there is one final inconsistency. Tucked into the back of a staff ledger, pressed flat by years of neglect, you find a small sepia-toned photograph no larger than the palm of your hand. It shows a line of household servants posed stiffly in a courtyard, aprons straight, jackets buttoned, the grand bulk of the mansion rising behind them. At first it looks like any other relic of a long-vanished domestic order, but as your eyes adjust, you notice that one figure near the center of the group has been crudely altered. Where a face should be, the surface is scarred by careful, deliberate scratching, as if someone took a pin or the tip of a knife and worked at the emulsion until the features were no longer recognizable. The uniform remains, the posture, the outline of shoulders. Only the identity is missing, erased not by time, but by a hand that needed that person to disappear twice, once from the house and once from the memory of the house. In families like the Vanderbilts, the servants might know what happened, but the lineage decides what officially exists. After the erased doorway on the floor plan and the scratched-out face in the photograph, the next layer of this dark legacy doesn't live in wages or whispers. It lives in the one place these Gilded Age dynasties believed would outlast everything else, their genealogies. So you move from the staff ledgers to a different shelf in the archive, where the dust is finer and the bindings are heavier. Here the books are proud of themselves. Leather spines stamped in gold, titles announcing the House of Vanderbilt, and ancestral lines of prominent American families. These volumes weren't meant to be hidden. They were meant to be displayed in drawing rooms and libraries, proof that the bloodline was orderly, legitimate, blessed with continuity. On their pages, the family tree spreads out in neat printed branches. Names, dates of birth, marriages, children, all laid out as if history were something that could be tamed into columns. At first, everything aligns with the official story you already know. Cornelius at the root, sons branching into railroad and shipping empires, daughters married into European or East Coast respectability. The Gilded Age imagination is all over these pages, portraits engraved alongside names, little flourishes of heraldry, occasional notes about distinguished service or philanthropic endeavors. It's only when you start matching these dates against the other traces, the midwives' receipt, the temporary annex lease, the sudden churn in the servants' ranks, that the gaps begin to show. There is a season where life in the house was clearly disrupted, money and people moving in unusual patterns. Yet on the genealogical charts, the line flows past those months as if nothing at all disturbed it. You turn a page and find a particularly polished family tree, prepared for publication in a late 19th century volume of American Who's Who. Under one branch, a simple phrase, issue, 3 children. No names are listed there, the details presumably given on a different page. But when you trace that line in the private handwritten notes tucked behind the printed genealogy, you encounter something more specific. A fragile sheet of paper, likely a working draft, where the same couple is annotated in ink as having 4 children. The number is later overwritten with a darker 3, the original stroke still faintly visible beneath it. No explanation, no marginal E. Correction, just an adjustment, as if someone decided at some point that one life no longer counted. Elsewhere, in a family Bible so large it requires both hands to open, births are recorded in a careful script. The entries follow a pattern: child's name, date, sometimes even the hour, a favorite detail in these houses that loved precision. The sequence is tidy until it isn't. Between 2 well-known children, there is a stretch of time that matches almost exactly the dates suggested by your other documents. On the page, however, The space between those entries looks oddly worked over. The paper is subtly rougher there, as if a pen lingered too long or a damp cloth passed over it more than once. In the right light, and at the right angle, you can see the ghosts of letters that no longer want to be read, not enough to spell a name with certainty, but enough to prove that something once stood there and was later removed. And then there's the private sketch, the kind of genealogical outline a family member might have drafted for an internal discussion about inheritance or trust arrangements. The lines are more tentative, the ink slightly uneven. Here and there, in the margin, notes appear. To receive property in Newport, not in line for certain holdings, married outside faith. In one branch, where the timeline intersects perfectly with the year of the midwife and the annex, there is a small, handwritten name placed between two siblings who are fully acknowledged elsewhere. It's not elaborated, not decorated, just there, occupying the slot that logic says would belong to a child born in that missing season. The name is then struck through with a single, deliberate line. Not the casual scratch of a mistake caught mid-sentence, but a measured stroke that begins slightly before the first letter and ends just after the last, as if someone wanted to be certain that this identity was technically still visible and officially canceled. This is where Golden Age secrets become, almost unbearable to look at because they force a quiet question on anyone paying attention. You're no longer dealing with rumors, anonymous servants, or ambiguous receipts. You're staring at overlapping evidence. A midwife paid off the books, a temporary residence arranged and then dissolved, servants shuffled out of the house in a tight cluster of weeks, and now here, a contested space in the family's own record, a slot in the line where a name once was and is no longer allowed to be. Faced with this overlaid pattern of erased records and hidden heirs, you can feel the pressure that must have surrounded the people who first noticed it. In a world where the Vanderbilt surname could open doors or close careers, would you have spoken up about what you saw? Or would you have turned the page, straightened the book on its shelf, and chosen silence rather than confronting the weight of a name like that? The fear of destroying reputations wasn't limited to scandal-hungry newspapers or rival families. It lived inside these houses, in the way elders spoke about protecting the younger generation, and lawyers reminded their clients that some truths, if acknowledged, carry legal consequences. The logic of inheritance in the Gilded Age was unforgiving. If a child could, even theoretically, claim a share of property or challenge a will, the mere acknowledgement of their existence could ripple outward into courtrooms, trust revisions, and public scrutiny. Better, the reasoning went to have never written the name at all, or, if it had been written in a moment of honesty or sentiment, to cross it out later and pretend it had never been there. Yet, paper is stubborn. Family Bibles change hands. Draft genealogies are folded into trunks and forgotten. Published trees go out of print and then find new life in used bookstores and archives. Decades layer over the panic of the original decision, leaving behind only the physical evidence of that panic. Ink scraped into paper. Words rubbed until the fibers thinned. The dark legacy of these choices is not simply the existence of a hidden heir, but the ongoing effort required to maintain their non-existence. It is a legacy built as much on what is absent as on what remains. You notice something telling in the margins of one of the printed genealogies, a handwritten note in a later hand, probably from the early 20th century, next to the carefully numbered children of a particular Vanderbilt couple. In faint pencil, someone has written, then half erased, the words, "all our children," with a small question mark that barely survived the attempt to remove it. The hesitation sits there on the page like a quiet accusation, a reminder that even within the family, not everyone was entirely convinced by the cleaned-up version of the past. Piece by piece, the pattern you've been following pulls tight. Receipts that don't belong, rooms that disappear from blueprints, servants who vanish from payroll, and now, a lineage that cannot fully hide its missing branch. The official histories of the Vanderbilt name still present an unbroken, polished line. But here, in the dim light of an archive reading room, a different outline emerges. a ghost branch, never fully drawn, never fully erased. You lift your eyes from the page to the walls of the mansion, to portraits where every face is accounted for, every name proudly recorded in plaques below the frames. And then you look back down at the private draft, at the single struck-through name sitting between two siblings who still exist in marble and oil. If there is an object in this house that contradicts the official story, it is this page. Not dramatic at first glance, not designed to shock visitors, but devastating once understood. A family that prided itself on the permanence of its legacy left behind, in its own careful handwriting, evidence of a life it decided not to carry forward. The line of ink over that name is thin, almost delicate. Still, it might as well be a locked door where a doorway once stood, or a face scratched from a photograph. The room grows very quiet as you realize that, for more than a century, this small act of erasure has been waiting here, in the dark, for someone willing to read beyond what the family chose to remember. By the time you reach the genealogies, it's clear that what vanished here wasn't just a name, but a claim. In a Gilded Age house like this, children were never only children. They were future. Signatures on contracts, future votes on boards, future signatures on checks that would decide whether fortunes stayed inside the family orbit or drifted out with an unwelcome marriage. So the next set of papers you pull from the archive isn't about birthdays or baptisms at all. It's about money. Thick folders, embossed letterheads, language so careful it reads like a foreign tongue. Issue, heirs of the body, legitimate children, collateral line. This is where the real stakes of a hidden birth emerge, not in the nursery, but in the clauses of agreements drawn up in quiet offices miles away from the mansion's ballroom light. Spread across the table, the documents look dry at first glance. Trust instruments divided between sons and daughters, settlements arranged upon marriage, provisions for any future children lawfully begotten. The wording is precise because it had to be. These were not casual promises. They governed railroads, shipping lines, real estate portfolios, entire webs of investment that stretched from Manhattan to Europe. The Vanderbilts didn't simply own things. They organized their holdings like a defensive wall, layers of trusts and settlements designed to keep wealth and influence in approved hands. Legitimacy in that structure was a gate. A child acknowledged in ink had the potential to unlock pieces of that wall. A child acknowledged only in whispers could be quietly sidelined, provided the record stayed obedient. You trace one particular row. Agreement, drafted in the very period suggested by the midwife's receipt and the erased name on the private family tree. It concerns a marriage alliance between a Vanderbilt heir and the daughter of another powerful family, a union meant to consolidate rail interests and blunt a rival's influence. The contract outlines what each side brings to the table: cash, property, bonds, social capital disguised as connections and goodwill. Then come the sections on children. Any legitimate male issue of this union, the language runs, shall stand first in succession to the designated properties and securities herein described. Further down, a clause appears that feels almost like a nervous cough committed to paper. Any issue born prior to the solemnization of this union, or not recognized as lawful offspring thereof, shall have no claim on the aforementioned estate. The ink on that line is slightly darker than the rest, the stroke of the pen heavier, as if someone pressed just a little. Harder to make sure there would be no misunderstanding. It's not hard to imagine the room where that decision solidified. A long table, heavy curtains half drawn against the street, lawyers in high-collared shirts flipping through draft after draft, while a Vanderbilt patriarch sits back, fingers drumming once against the polished wood before going still. No raised voices, no melodrama, just the quiet adjustment of a phrase here, a line there, until the contract does exactly what it needs to do. Build a legal world in which a certain kind of child simply does not exist. Golden Age secrets weren't always about affairs whispered in corridors. They were about sentences like this, buried in paragraphs most people would never read. You move on to wills, codicils, memoranda written in restrained, almost chilly language. One testament, revised close to the year of your missing branch, includes a curious line. I further affirm that all my children have been properly accounted for in this disposition as per the enclosed schedule. The schedule, a separate sheet tucked into a pocket in the back, lists beneficiaries by initial rather than full name, as if to add an extra layer of discretion. The sequence is familiar. 3 children whose identities can be matched to public records, their shares clearly defined. And then there is a gap, a number skipped, a line missing, as though whoever typed the list originally left space and then returned to remove a line without tightening the numbering. To anyone glancing quickly, it would look like nothing. To anyone who has already seen the crossed-out name on the private genealogy, it looks like a negative space shaped like a person. What makes this more than coincidence are the letters that orbit these legal documents like small, anxious moons. Notes from bankers asking for clarification on potential claims from collateral relations. A discreet inquiry from a European cousin, wondering in careful language whether all branches of the family have been fully aligned with the new financial arrangement. A carbon copy of a letter from a Vanderbilt attorney to a partner firm, stating flatly that there exists no other issue with any legal standing to contest the present structure. The sentence is underscored in pencil by someone at some later date, the line wavering slightly at the end, as if the hand holding the pencil was not entirely convinced. In the cold logic of succession, a child out of place isn't just an embarrassment. It's a variable, a potential claimant who could, under the right circumstances, appear in a courtroom with witnesses and documents of their own, asking why they were omitted from a legacy that shaped entire city blocks. To prevent that possibility, lives were redirected long before any adult lawsuit could be imagined. An infant kept off the official books becomes a teenager living under another name, perhaps in another state, their upbringing financed indirectly through charity, payments or education stipends routed through intermediaries. If they never learned who they really were, they could never come knocking on the heavy doors of this house. And even if they did, the altered records would stand like a wall. Bibles scrubbed, genealogies adjusted, legal agreements written to anticipate their existence only to deny their validity. The price of protecting a legacy like this shows up not only in who is crossed out, but in who is doubled down on, in amended contracts. You see language strengthening the position of the recognized heirs, bonuses for marriages that align with family strategy, clauses that cut off anyone whose behavior might threaten respectability, provisions that allow trustees to withhold distributions in cases of scandal. The message, tucked into the careful phrasing, is simple. We will defend the clean line at all costs. The dark legacy is not an accident of passion, it's a calculus. Again and again, you see the same tools deployed. Records modified, numbers adjusted, phrases added to guarantee that the paper world and the public world match the story the Vanderbilts wanted to tell. Erased records in this context are not random losses, they are deliberate acts. Whole pages removed from minute books, entries scraped from ledgers, annotations added to explain away gaps as loss by fire or damage due to flood. And yet the surviving scraps resist complete control. A midwife's receipt that no one thought to destroy, a servant's photograph that someone tried to alter instead of burn. A private draft genealogy no one remembered was tucked between more polished public books. So you come back to the same quiet, uncomfortable question, now edged not just with moral unease, but with the cold outlines of contracts and cash. If you pieced all of this together, if you recognized that one life had been systematically removed to keep a series of deals intact, what would you do? Would you speak, knowing that you'd be challenging not just a family story but an entire architecture of privilege? Or would you close the folder, let the hinge of the archive box click shut, and decide that some truths are too expensive to acknowledge? As you hesitate over that thought, your hand brushes against the bottom of the legal file and touches something that isn't paper. Tucked beneath the last sheaf of contract copies is a narrow velvet-lined case, the kind used for presenting ceremonial items at a board meeting or family gathering. Inside, resting in a shallow impression worn smooth by time, lies a small engraved silver spoon. On its handle, the family crest is unmistakable. On its bowl, barely visible beneath a patch of deliberate scratching, are the remnants of letters, enough to suggest they once spelled a first name that never appears in any official record. A christening gift, prepared for a child who could not, on paper, be allowed to exist. The room seems to draw in around that object, and for a long moment, the only sound is the faint rasp of metal against velvet as the case settles back into the dark. By the time you close the velvet case on that scratched silver spoon, it's obvious that the missing child was never treated as a rumor inside this world. They were treated as a problem to be managed. And in the Gilded Age, problems of this kind were rarely confronted head-on. They were dissolved into paper and absence. So the trail you follow now moves away from the grand, embossed contracts of inheritance and into something that looks, at first, much smaller. Civil records, parish books, household reports, all the minor bureaucracies that were supposed to make people official. If a life was removed from the Vanderbilt story, it had to be removed from these places as well, or at least bent until it no longer contradicted what the family wanted to be true. You start with the most basic footprint of existence: birth records. In the late 19th century, registration in parts of New York was uneven, but families of this rank were usually thoroughly documented. They liked the order of it, the sense that future historians would be able to trace their properly recorded rise. As you scroll through microfilmed ledgers and handwritten indexes under dull reading room light, the names of the wealthy appear with predictable regularity. Children born at city residences, at country houses, even occasionally abroad, all wrapped in clear entries: date, place, parents. When you reach the window of months suggested by the midwife's receipt and the annex lease, the pattern falters. There is a gap where a Vanderbilt birth should have created a small ripple in the civil archive. Instead, you see other families, other addresses, an unbroken set of strangers. The absence is quiet, but it sits uncomfortably beside everything you already know. It would be easy to shrug that off as coincidence, if not for the way the church records behave. The Vanderbilt name appears regularly in the baptismal books of certain parishes. Beautiful ledgers with marbled edges, entries written in careful ink by rectors accustomed to discreetly blessing the children of the city's elite. Here, again, the pattern is strong. A cluster of ceremonies around each generation, godparents drawn from neighboring mansions on Fifth Avenue, notes about choir music or special floral arrangements. Then you reach the crucial year, and the pattern glides past it as if it were an untouched patch of ice. No extra baptism wedged between cousins, no private ceremony annotated in the margins. Instead, there is a faint disturbance in the physical book itself, a page whose lower corner has been neatly trimmed away, taking with it a small section where an additional line might once have fit. The cut is precise, done with a blade rather than torn by accident. The surrounding entries are intact, names and dates marching on. Only that small absence remains, thin as a shut door in one of the house's forbidden rooms. Beyond the official channels, there are the things families never intended to show anyone: diaries, notebooks, domestic reports. In another box, labeled blandly as miscellaneous household papers, you find the fragmented remains of a housekeeper's log. Its entries read like the skeleton of daily life: deliveries, repairs, extra linens ordered for visiting relatives. Around the time you've been tracing, the tone shifts. Suddenly, there are notes about additional supplies for upstairs. Room, milk and blankets for annex, arrangements for staff rotation, second property. The words never name a child, never mention a mother, but the pattern is unmistakable. Someone small, someone fragile, has become part of the logistics. Then, just as quickly, the references stop. A later page, still in the same hand, mentions reduction of extra costs and return to standard provisioning. Between those two phases, a few leaves are missing entirely, their stubs still visible along the spine, as if someone decided that certain days of that winter did not need to survive. Elite Americans of the era often relied on quiet adoptions and new surnames to tidy away what didn't fit their golden age image. Historical cases show children placed with distant relatives, trusted servants, or anonymous families in other neighborhoods, accompanied by vague phrases like a change in family arrangements or support for a young person in need. In one bundle of correspondence connected loosely to the Vanderbilt legal files, you come across a letter from a small-town attorney upstate thanking a benefactor for regular remittances in support of the boy's upbringing, as agreed. The boy is never named, the benefactor never identified directly, but the timing of the payments lines up with the period just after the annex is closed and the staff ledger quiets down. The amounts are too large to be casual charity, too structured to be spontaneous kindness. The remittances continue for years, and then taper off at the exact moment another legal document in the Vanderbilt archive notes that all outstanding obligations connected to earlier private arrangements are considered concluded. The quiet mechanisms of erasure show up even in the way gaps are explained. In a crude copy of a household expense report, someone has underlined a line item labeled simply additional costs and written in the margin, in pencil, to be justified as heating repairs. The handwriting matches a steward, whose name appears elsewhere as an intermediary in delicate matters. The phrase carries no obvious scandal, but in context, annex, midwife, changing servants, scratched genealogies, it reads like a whispered instruction to future auditors. If anyone asks, say the money went to bricks, not flesh. Scattered through personal papers are phrases that lean toward confession, then pull back. A cousin's diary mentions a visit to the city where something was tense in the house, everyone walking softer than usual, as if not to disturb what could not be discussed. Another relative jots a note on the back of a theater program. Arrangement finally settled. Some things must be known only to God and the lawyers. The page is later folded sharply, the words nearly obscured by the crease. These writers are long dead, their ability to explain themselves permanently erased. All that remains is the residue of their hesitation, the way their pens hovered at the edge of naming what the family had worked. So hard to blur. In stories about hidden heirs and dark legacy, it's tempting to imagine grand gestures of deletion, bonfires of documents, shouting matches in paneled rooms. But the reality of these golden age secrets is often quieter than that. A form never filed. A baptism postponed until it can be replaced by an untraceable ceremony somewhere else. A child recorded under another man's surname in a different county's register. The erasure is not the absence of all paperwork. It is the careful redirection of paperwork until the trail leads away from the Vanderbilt name as efficiently as the railroads once led toward it. Piece by piece, what emerges is a picture of a life treated not as an accident, but as a variable. Someone was born who could not exist, not because they didn't breathe or cry or grow, but because acknowledging them would have cracked the delicate geometry of contracts, alliances, and respectability. So they were administered, budgeted for, hidden in annexes perhaps. Moved to another household, their costs disguised as maintenance, their presence referred to only in phrases that evaporate the moment you look too closely. By the time the mechanisms have finished their work, the official story can say, with technical accuracy, that there is no Vanderbilt child of that name. The paper agrees. The Bibles, the contracts, the civil and church ledgers all line up in a chorus of silence. And yet, there is always something that resists. At the bottom of one last box, beneath loose pages and an empty envelope, you find a thin, cloth-bound notebook, its cover worn smooth at the edges. Inside, most of the pages are blank, but near the middle, a few lines have been written and then attacked with ink until they are nothing but black bars scarring the paper. Under strong light, and from a shallow angle, you can just make out the shape of a sentence that once began with, "He is now settled," before the rest dissolves under the spill. Beneath the stains, a single word remains untouched at the start of the next line. as if the pen slipped or the eraser missed it. Remember. It hangs there, alone in the white space, the only word on the page that someone tried and failed to scrub away, and for a long moment it feels louder than anything in the official record. At some point, as you move from contracts and ledgers into the thinner, more fragile papers, it stops feeling like you're investigating a scandal and starts feeling like you're tracing the outline of a person who was never supposed to stand up. In the cold logic of the Gilded Age, this child exists only sideways. There is no birth certificate in the city books, no baptism in the parish register, no proud announcement in the society columns. What you have instead is a scattering of traces, like ash on polished marble. A midwife's receipt with no name attached, only the address of a discreet annex. A short-term lease for temporary accommodations that ends as abruptly as it began. A servant's sudden dismissal followed by a politely urgent letter of recommendation, praising discretion in difficult circumstances. A line in a household report about additional costs later disguised as repair work. Taken one by one, they could be anything. Taken together, they describe the outline of a life treated as a variable in an equation, a column in someone else's private ledger. If you try to imagine this child inside the house, you run up against the limits of the archive because, these people were careful never to write down the details that made them nervous. Still, there are small slips. A corner of a diary kept by a junior maid mentions being sent upstairs with milk again, told not to speak of it below stairs. No name, no room number. Just the lingering impression of someone small, someone who required care and secrecy at the same time. In another notebook, a coachman notes a late-night journey to the second property with the nurse and a parcel. The word parcel, underlined in a way that doesn't quite match the rest of his shorthand. The child never appears directly, only refracted through other people's duties: feed, carry, deliver, move. In this gallery of Golden Age secrets, they are the one figure who never gets a face. What makes it more striking is how thoroughly this life is framed as an administrative issue. The language in internal memos and private letters is almost aggressively neutral. Arrangement to be concluded. Outstanding obligation. Resolved. All parties satisfied that no future complication will arise. There is no description of a first cry, no mention of eyes or hair, no anecdote about a laugh echoing down the corridor of a forbidden room. On paper, the child is a problem type, something that might destabilize inheritance, complicate a marriage alliance, or draw the press too close to the thresholds of a very controlled house. The people handling it behave like managers, not guardians. They assign tasks, schedule movements, calculate payments, adjust records until the math looks clean again. It's the kind of structural coldness that makes the dark legacy here feel heavier than any single act of cruelty. Yet the human side keeps leaking through the cracks. The silver spoon, for example, is not something you commission for a mistake. It's a christening object, engraved in anticipation, the family crest pressed into metal so that a baby could, in theory, grow up seeing their identity reflected in their own hand. Someone ordered it. Someone designed the curve of the handle, chose the font for the letters that were later scratched away. You can almost picture the moment the decision shifted. The same hands that approved the engraving later working a small, sharp tool back and forth over the bowl until the name blurred into meaningless scratches. Not thrown away, not melted down. Just altered enough that, if ever questioned, it could be dismissed as a generic heirloom. A hidden heir, reduced to a damaged object in a drawer. In the context of the Gilded Age, where elite Americans obsessively curated their image, these quiet mechanisms of erasure were part of a broader pattern. Newspapers could be steered with access and advertising money. Editors learned quickly which rumors about powerful families were safe to set in type and which belonged only in private conversations after the theater. If a story about an irregular child threatened to surface, it could be smothered under a more palatable narrative: charity, tragedy, or simple misreporting. The public heard about Vanderbilt endowments to universities, about glittering balls and architectural marvels, Not about annex rooms with drawn curtains or servants who left with unspeakable knowledge. The gap between what the dynasty said about itself and what its private records hint at is not just about one child. It's about the cost of maintaining a flawless facade in a world built on inequality and control. So you keep following the fragments, and the fragments keep circling back to the same unspoken presence. A tailor's bill for altering infant garments no longer required. A line in a distant cousin's letter about someone we no longer mention, though arrangements have been made. A receipt for train travel purchased under a name that never appears again in any Vanderbilt-related document, paid in cash by an intermediary. Every piece reinforces the sense that this life was not abandoned to chance. It was routed, redirected away from the family's main line like a train switched onto a side track at the last legal moment. Somewhere, beyond the reach of these archives, that track may have continued for decades. Here, it ends in ellipses. In that sense, this is less a story about a lost child and more about the machinery built to make sure that child stayed conceptually lost. The Gilded Age loved order, and order in these houses meant knowing exactly who belonged at which table, in which portrait, on which tree. A child born out of sequence, out of bounds, couldn't be allowed to scramble the hierarchy, so the family's paper world closed around them. Erased records, altered Bibles, adjusted genealogies, silent witnesses eased out of the house before they could solidify into risk. The result is a person who survives only as a series of administrative shadows. Their presence is undeniable in aggregate, yet nowhere fully acknowledged, which leads to the quiet question that hangs over the table as you look down at these pieces. If you uncovered, buried deep in a house like this, the traces of a whole life reduced to footnotes in private files, what would you do with it? Not the romantic idea of confronting a villain in a velvet armchair, but the real choice. Accept the dominant narrative and walk away, or open up a golden age secret that was never supposed to breathe fresh air. To speak would be to challenge not only a family's story, but the architecture of deference that still surrounds certain names. To remain silent would be to participate, however passively, in the same long line of decisions that turned a person into a logistical inconvenience. As that thought settles, your eyes drift back to the physical space of the mansion. Tour guides now speak in measured tones about craftsmanship and design, about the triumphs of American industry, about the Vanderbilt role in shaping modern New York. Visitors photograph ceilings and staircases, admire portraits where every face is labeled, every relationship neatly explained. Then you remember the erased doorway on the old floor plan, the scratched-out servant in the courtyard photograph, the struck-through name on the draft family tree, the defaced spoon in its velvet bed. Together, they form a composite portrait of someone who is never shown. And when you return, one last time, to that private genealogical page and see the single line of ink dragging across the space where a name once lived, it feels less like a correction and more like a curtain, pulled tight for more than a century, over a story that refuses, even now, to disappear completely from the margins. If you step back from the fragments, the erased name, the scratched spoon, the trimmed parish page, and let your eyes adjust again to the grand scale of the Gilded Age, you almost understand how the secret held for so long. Because on the surface, the Vanderbilt image was as polished as the marble foyers of their Fifth Avenue mansions. The IEE public story was not just curated, it was engineered. In the columns of the New York Herald and the Times, their lives moved like a flawless pageant. Charity balls lit by thousands of gas lamps, portraits unveiled before society's finest, carefully timed donations to universities and churches, seasonal departures to Newport, framed as symbols of tradition rather than escape. No one reading those columns would suspect hidden heirs or forbidden rooms. The narrative was airtight, and its smoothness was the first line of defense. Look closely at photographs from the era, those stiff, regal compositions where every member of the household sits in absolute clarity, faces arranged like chess pieces on velvet backdrops. The men stand with measured pride. The women pose with practiced stillness. The children look dutifully toward the future expected of them. Nothing is out of place. Every detail supports the myth of a family whose power was the natural result of industriousness and moral superiority. These photographs were circulated to the press, gifted to museums, reproduced in society annuals. They were public currency, purchased with reputation rather than gold. And yet, when you've spent enough time in the archives, their perfection starts to feel like insulation, thick, deliberate, and suspiciously airtight. The Gilded Age made reputation into an asset as valuable as a railroad line. A scandal didn't just bruise feelings. It destabilized mergers, threatened investments, jeopardized alliances decades in the making. Behind every smiling portrait was a machinery of damage control stronger than some city governments. Editors received quiet visits. Printers misplaced certain typeset lines. Columnists learned that certain names should never appear beside the words rumor, indiscretion, or unexpected. Even the gossip writers, those who thrived on the missteps of the wealthy, knew which families were off limits unless they wanted their careers strangled in silence. So, when a Vanderbilt domestic situation risked becoming something more dangerous, something that involved lineage, legitimacy, and the threat of a new claimant, there was no chance it would bleed into public view. The decision to erase the child did not come alone. It came with a set of motions already well practiced in other contexts. The shutting of doors, the dismissal of servants, the removal of pages, the removal of names. A dynasty that managed railroads like living organisms could manage its image without breaking a sweat. Philanthropy was the brightest shield. For every suspicious gap in the genealogy, there was a new endowment announced. For every servant abruptly sent away, a hospital wing received a gift. For every erased record, a glowing profile appeared in a magazine praising the family's stability in times of social change. It was a symphony played over the sound of burning letters. If a journalist ever tried to ask the wrong question, they found themselves invited to a more glamorous story instead: a charity gala, a political dinner, a European visit filled with enough visual grandeur to make any darker curiosity feel petty. But while the world was distracted by gilt and glass, the private documents you've been studying tell a different story. The tone inside them is chilly, transactional, stripped of all the charm that filled the society pages. A Vanderbilt cousin writes, "Public matters remain undisturbed, as they must." A family attorney notes, "Any potential disruption has been resolved to the satisfaction of all parties." These lines are not triumphant, only tired. They read like the inner voice of a dynasty that has learned to protect itself not just from rumor, but from truth. Even the accounts of chroniclers, those social diarists who made a living observing the wealthy, provide a strange contrast. In their published books, the Vanderbilt name appears as untouchable, paragons of order, elegance, foresight. But in their private notes, the ink thins whenever their comments brush up against the months you've been tracing. One writes, "The house was unusually subdued this season. Rooms closed, guests fewer than expected." Another, "Attention there, though no one would name it. Outwardly, nothing cracked. Inwardly, you can feel the pressure where the story bends. And now, as you sit in the present, surrounded by boxes whose lids have not been lifted in decades, that perfect public image begins to fray, not loudly, but quietly, like silk coming loose from its stitching." The Golden Age secrets preserved here never meant to resurface, never meant to collide with the modern eye. Yet they do. The contrast is devastating. A dynasty famous for its glittering transparency, and beneath it, the shadows of hidden heirs, silent witnesses, and erased records. You might even imagine the house itself remembering. Tourists walk through rooms restored to photographic perfection. Chandeliers glowing exactly as they once did. Banisters reflecting the shine of a century ago. Guides recite dates and names, every detail polished. No one ever mentions the annex, or the servants who vanished in a single season, or the erased doorway, or the scratched-out face in the courtyard photograph. And then, just as you prepare to close another ledger, something shifts in the light. A portrait on the wall, grand, celebratory, impossible to ignore, catches the sun at an angle that reveals something strange. Along the bottom edge of the canvas, where the painter originally signed their name, there is an area of pigment that doesn't quite match, a section of varnish slightly duller than the rest. It is a thin rectangle, barely noticeable unless you know to look for seams. Under that patch of paint, almost certainly, lies an earlier draft of the composition, a version of the portrait where there may have been one more figure. At a certain point, the story stops belonging only to the Vanderbilts and their lawyers, and starts belonging to the people who open the boxes now. The house that once employed butlers and maids now employs archivists and conservators. The forbidden rooms have become exhibition spaces. The silent witnesses are no longer servants afraid of losing their positions, but historians sitting under fluorescent lights, reading the same traces you've been following and asking themselves a different kind of question. Not what happened. They know they will never have the full answer, but what do we dare to say? Out loud? In the calm of a modern reading room, the drama of the Gilded Age is filtered through pencils and laptops. Someone has to decide whether the scratched name on the draft genealogy appears in print, whether the midwife's address is reproduced in an appendix, whether the phrase hidden heirs is used in a chapter title or kept tucked away in a footnote. The ethics here are not tidy. On one side, there's the responsibility to truth, to acknowledging that the dark legacy in these papers is real, that the Golden Age secrets were not just gossip, but a structure that turned people into variables. On the other, there's the obligation not to overstate what the evidence can bear. There is no surviving confession, no single document that says, in plain turn-of-the-century ink, a Vanderbilt child was born here and then erased. What exists is a web of erased records, silent witnesses, and objects that contradict the official narrative. That web is strong, but it is still a web. In internal meetings, the debates can be as tense in their own way as any negotiation once held over inheritance. One scholar insists that naming the probable parents is necessary, that anything less would be another act of erasure. Another argues for restraint, pointing out the gaps, the missing pages, the fact that the people most implicated in this story cannot answer for themselves. A younger researcher suggests a middle path. Outline the evidence, show exactly how the fragments align, use careful language, likely, strongly suggests, consistent with, and let readers feel the weight of the pattern without claiming a verdict the archive cannot legally deliver. There is also the question of the child. Giving them a name, even a reconstructed one, feels to some like an act of restoration, a way of pulling a hidden life back from the margins. To others, it feels like a second appropriation, using a speculative identity to anchor a narrative in ways that might satisfy modern hunger for closure, while still knowing that the person themselves never had a chance to define who they were. In draft manuscripts, you sometimes see the same first name appear and disappear in the text, replaced by phrases like the erased child, the unregistered birth, the life in the margins. The cursor blinks where the name used to be, a 21st century echo of that thin line of ink dragging across the family tree. Historians of this world know that Gilded Age families were practiced at controlling their image. They also know that our own time is not innocent when it comes to stories about power. There's a real danger in swinging too far the other way, turning every unflattering discovery into a simple morality play where the dynasty is purely monstrous and the hidden heir is a symbolic victim rather than a person whose life, wherever it unfolded, was undoubtedly messy, ordinary, maybe even indifferent to the drama in these files. So the modern apparatus of scholarship, footnotes, critical introductions, cautious phrases, becomes its own kind of architecture, this time meant to protect the truth from being bent too hard in any direction. In practice, that means the published work reads differently from the whispered conversations in the archive. On the printed page, Phrases like public image, private damage control, administrative management of inconvenient births, and strategic use of adoption and erasure sit alongside references to other documented cases among American elites, anchoring the Vanderbilt story in a broader pattern rather than treating it as monstrous exception. The terms hidden heirs, forbidden rooms, silent witnesses, and dark legacy might appear in a chapter heading for a general audience. But in the endnotes, they are unpacked with lists of sources, alternate interpretations, and long discussions of what we can and cannot know. Behind those choices, you can see the small hesitations of the people doing the work. A curator stands in an empty gallery before an upcoming exhibition, asking whether a facsimile of the scratched servant photograph should be shown without digital repair, whether the defaced silver spoon should be placed under glass or kept as a reference object in the study collection. A legal consultant reminds the team that descendants still exist, that even now certain names may carry the weight of defamation claims if asserted too directly. A community historian argues that the focus should not be on shaming one family, but on exposing how entire systems of wealth and respectability made it possible for a life to be turned into an administrative shadow. The result is a kind of choreography. The exhibition labels speak in measured sentences. Some archival evidence suggests the possibility of an unacknowledged child whose existence was not fully recorded in official family documents. The catalog essay goes further, tracing the financial and genealogical overlaps with precision. The online materials for a broader audience weave atmosphere and caution together, using the language of mystery without promising a solution. A Gilded Age house, Golden Age secrets, a pattern of erased records that points to a hidden heir who never officially existed. And you, still standing in that mansion now museum, become part of this debate without realizing it. The narrative you've been hearing, this story, told in a low, analytic voice that points from midwife receipts to altered wills to scratched portraits, has been shaped by those meetings, those arguments, those footnotes. It is not neutral, but it has been tempered. You are being shown enough to feel the weight of what happened, and also invited to see where the evidence fades into speculation. There is a kind of honesty in that, however late it arrives. So what do you do with a truth that is strong enough to disturb the official story, but not neat enough to be carved into a monument? Modern historians answer in layers. They publish articles that lay out the chain of documents step by step, inviting other scholars to test their reading. They design tours that mention unsettling discoveries in the archives and questions about who is remembered and who is not. They annotate the old genealogies with small, careful marks, brackets, question marks, phrases like possible omitted issue. They resist, where they can, the temptation to either romanticize the Vanderbilts as tragic figures or flatten them into cartoon villains. The goal is not to cleanse the family name, nor to burn it down, but to show how power behaved when it thought no one would ever read the fine print. In the end, the ethics of naming come down to a simple tension: the desire to bring the erased child fully into the light, and the obligation to admit that the archive stops just short of a full resurrection. There is enough here to dismantle the fantasy of a perfectly clean lineage. There is enough to prove that a life was treated as a risk variable, that Golden Age secrets were enforced through quiet violence against memory. There is not enough to give you the child's voice, their face, their own account of what it meant to live beyond these walls under another name. So the story you're hearing does something else instead. It turns, gently but firmly, toward you. If all you can see are fragments, then the most honest thing is to show the fragments clearly, to name the pattern they form, and to leave the last step, judgment, outrage, reflection, on your side of the glass. That's why the narration keeps asking you small questions, the ones that echo long after the video ends. What would you do if you recognized a life reduced to footnotes? Would you repeat the family's silence or break it, knowing you'll never have every detail? As the camera of your mind's eye drifts back to the archive table, there is one last image to hold. The private genealogical draft you saw before, the one with the thin, deliberate line scoring out a name between two acknowledged siblings, has been placed inside a transparent sleeve for preservation. A modern note has been slipped behind it, printed in small, unobtrusive type, explaining the context and the limits of what can be said. The old ink and the new commentary sit on top of one another like two ages in conversation. From a distance, you see only a clean page with a single, violent stroke through the center. Up close, you can read both the original erasure and the present-day attempt to frame it. The page is returned to its box, the lid closed with practiced care. But that line, that name buried under ink, and the quiet, bracketed question mark now printed beside it, remains suspended in the dark, waiting, after more than a century, for whoever opens the file next and has to decide, once again, how much of that silence they're willing to leave untouched. Once you've traced the erased child through annexes, ledgers, and genealogies, it becomes harder to look at the rest of the Gilded Age in the same romantic light. The Vanderbilt story doesn't stand alone in this archive. It sits in a wider landscape of Golden Age secrets, one case in a quiet pattern that stretches from Fifth Avenue to Beacon Hill, from railroad barons to mining kings. Open enough boxes in enough old houses, and you start to recognize the same choreography. Hidden heirs moved off stage, forbidden rooms left off official floor plans, silent witnesses eased out of service with unusually generous references, erased records patched over with phrases like "fire in the records office" or "lost in transit." In one family's papers, you might find a banker's letter worrying about irregular issue and its effect on a trust. In another, a draft will with a clause scratched out so hard the paper thins. A clause that once began, "in the event of any child born prior to," before the ink was driven into the fibers like a nail. The method changes, the names change, but the logic stays eerily familiar. Historians who work across these collections sometimes talk, off the record, about the ghost branch problem. The phrase is their shorthand for these almost children of the Gilded Age, lives that show up as faint outlines on the edges of otherwise immaculate pedigrees. You see them in a Rockefellian cousin supported quietly in Europe under another surname, in a steel magnate's protege whose education is curiously overfunded, in a senator's ward whose presence is explained one way to visitors and another way in private letters. The public narratives celebrate philanthropy and civic duty. The private fragments reveal how often those gifts doubled as cover for damage control. In that sense, the Vanderbilt dossier is not an anomaly. It's a well-documented specimen of a broader species of dark legacy. Even the mechanisms of erasure repeat from house to house. A parish book where only one page has been cleanly excised, the cut too precise to be accidental. A city ledger with a gap in the numbering sequence for a single week, later reconstructed from copies that conspicuously omit one address. A run of society columns where a prominent couple disappears from mention for a season, only to return with their image brighter than before, their charity work louder, as if to drown out any whisper that might have escaped while they were withdrawing behind heavy curtains. In the background of these stories, you can almost hear the same quiet. Instructions being given in different voices. Call the editor, speak to the rector, move that servant, adjust that account, close that door. To rewrite the golden narrative honestly is not to throw out the mansions and the balls. Those exist. They mattered. They shaped cities and imaginations. But they are incomplete without the archives that were destroyed or hidden to support them. A true map of the Gilded Age has to include both the front facades, captured in photographs meant for public circulation, and the back staircases where servants paused, listening for the wrong name spoken at the wrong time. It has to hold the fact that some of the most powerful families in America not only managed their futures through trusts and mergers, they managed their pasts, carefully editing what counted as real. In that sense, the unregistered Vanderbilt birth isn't just a tragic footnote. It's a keyhole through which you glimpse how the elite treated memory itself as another asset to be controlled. Modern scholarship on this period has begun to shift accordingly. Where older histories focused on architectural plans and guest lists, newer studies linger over blank spaces, missing volumes, suspiciously uniform accounts in newspapers that were otherwise delighted by scandal. Researchers compare civil registers with family Bibles, cross-reference ship manifests with private correspondence, and keep finding the same unsettling alignments. Stretches of time where an heir could exist, in principle, matched with financial anomalies, staff changes, and then nothing. Hidden heirs who never made it onto the official page. Forbidden rooms that never appear on the finalized blueprint. Silent witnesses whose names vanish from payroll precisely when the story would have needed them to stay. Each case on its own might be dismissed as coincidence. Together, they form a backdrop against which the Vanderbilt file stops looking like a dramatic exception and starts looking like a rare instance where the pattern has survived just enough to be seen. That changes how you stand in a house like this one. The marble still shines, the gilding still catches the light, but every polished surface feels like it might be covering something. The narrative that museums and guidebooks long offered, of progress, artistry, self-made dynasties, lifting a nation into modernity, now has to be threaded with a quieter counterstory. A story in which reputations were reinforced with the same hardness that built railroads, in which dark legacy isn't a metaphor, but a ledger of choices about who would be allowed to exist in the record and who would be managed into the margins. To understand the Gilded Age now is to accept that some of its most enduring achievements were built alongside, and sometimes on top of, carefully orchestrated forgetting. And yet the process of rewriting is not about tearing down these histories in anger, so much as insisting on seeing them whole. The Vanderbilt case becomes a teaching tool, not because it is uniquely monstrous, but because it is unusually well documented for a world that usually burned what it wanted to forget. It shows how easily a birth can be turned into a risk assessment, how smoothly a name can be transformed into a variable to be eliminated from an equation. It shows, too, how stubborn the archive can be when it refuses to fully comply. A receipt missed in the purge, a draft genealogy misfiled instead of destroyed, a photograph altered instead of discarded. Those stubborn remnants are why you can stand here now, more than a century later, and feel the story pushing back against the version the family thought would last forever. By the time you return in your mind to the room where this began, a quiet space in a Vanderbilt-linked mansion, restoration dust still hanging in the light, you can see the scene differently. The box that held the unmarked dossier no longer feels like a random find. It feels like the end of a long chain of decisions, each one meant to keep this bundle from ever being opened, and each one, ironically, preserving it just enough for the future. The archivist who first lifted the lid probably shrugged at the sight of old receipts and household notes, never suspecting they were touching the edges of a golden age secret. Only later, as dates and names began to align across separate collections, did the outline of the hidden heir appear, not as a fully formed figure, but as the negative space where the record breaks. Now, with that outline in your head, the physical setting acquires a new weight. The walls seem closer. The polished floorboards carry the faint echo of steps from people who walked away before they could write down what they knew. The neat row of labeled boxes on their metal shelves reads like a series of closed doors in another kind of corridor. You know, statistically, that this is just one case among many. That elsewhere in the country, in houses whose names are less famous, other erased records and silent witnesses are still waiting in the dark. But here, in this particular room, the story has surfaced just enough to bend the official history of a dynasty. On the table in front of you, the thin dossier lies where you last left it. Midwife receipts, staff lists, genealogical drafts, legal clauses, the photograph with the scratched-out face, the note that ends with the word "remember." And at the top of the stack, half slipped from its sleeve as if it has been trying to leave its hiding place for years, is that private family tree. The inked line slashing through the missing child's name cuts across the page with the same steady hand that once signed trusts, contracts, and public donations. For a long moment, nothing moves. Then the slightest current of air from the opening of a distant door stirs the paper, and that line seems to tremble, just enough to remind you that, no matter how firmly it was drawn, it was still made by a human hand, on a page that can at last be read. When the last sheet is slipped back into its sleeve, and the draft genealogy lies once more beneath its thin veil of plastic, the room returns to its original stillness. The light that caught the trembling line of ink withdraws from the page and settles again on plaster moldings, polished wood, and frames that have watched generations pass without ever admitting what was excised from their history. Somewhere beyond these walls, the official story of the Gilded Age remains intact: grand houses, flawless pedigrees, fortunes cleanly transmitted. Here, on this table, the afterimage of an unrecorded birth lingers in dust motes and marginalia, a quiet indictment written not in names, but in absences. What cannot be restored is as important as what has surfaced. The child whose existence you have traced through receipts, leases, and erased records will never stand up fully from the paper. There will be no certain face, no definitive line in any public tree. Yet, the trail itself speaks. The corrections, the struck-through name, the altered clauses, the silent witnesses pushed out of view. All of it testifies to a deliberate shaping of the past, a dark legacy in which memory was managed as ruthlessly as money. The birth they would not acknowledge does not appear in the family books, but it is inscribed in the very effort to make it vanish, and now, unavoidably, in our investigation of those efforts. From here, the corridor of history branches outward. Other houses, other dynasties, other forbidden rooms wait in the half-light, their own hidden heirs and golden age secrets locked behind doors that were never meant to open again. If you wish to be present when the next sealed door finally yields, remain with us, so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. Every careful reading of these erased records pushes back, however slightly, against the silence that once seemed absolute. And if this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again, that these silent witnesses and dark corridors deserve to be seen once more. Beyond this dossier, the archive does not end. It merely turns a corner into deeper shadow. Other files wait with their own contradictions, other portraits with their own scars of repainting, other names that never made it past the margins. If you are willing to step further into those shadows, the next chamber awaits. Somewhere behind another row of numbered boxes and another carefully closed door, there is a page, a line, an object that contradicts the official tale and has been waiting for decades to be noticed. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth. And sometimes, after a very long silence, the first crack in that fear is simply this: a single name, scored through, but still visible, on a page that refuses to forget.